So, good morning all, and welcome to this latest webinar in the CABA Biodiversity webinar series. This is the third of the webinars in our series, and we have the recordings from previous sessions will be available on the CABA YouTube channel. I will share a link to that in the chat in just a moment. The previous two sessions looked at the CABA biodiversity package, which enables practitioners to access and utilise biodiversity data to help with project planning. And the second webinar in the series looked at the opportunities to undertake stage 0 river restoration. And if you didn't manage to join us for those, well worth having a look back at those recordings. The session we are running today is looking at lakes and the opportunities to restore lakes and their catchments and the role that lakes can play in the nature recovery network. I am going to be your chair for today. My name is Ali Morse and I'm the Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts. I'm also a member of the CABA Biodiversity Group, which is one of the working groups set up under the catchment-based approach to help practitioners incorporate biodiversity delivery into their catchment programmes. Our speaker today is Glenn Cooper, Senior Advisor on Lake Restoration with Natural England and Coordinator of the CABA Biodiversity Group. So without further ado, I will hand over to Glenn for this session. Feel free to pop questions in the chat as we're going through. When we come to the discussion session at the end, depending on how many questions we have, I will either invite people to come in and ask their questions, or if we've got lots, I will try and keep track of them and then sort of collate them on your behalf and put the questions to Glenn. So is there anything else I need to say before we get started? No, I think that is probably everything. So, oh no, I have thought of one more final thing, which is that we have one further session in this webinar series planned, taking place in December, and that's on floodplain meadows. I will pop the registration link for that in the chat for anyone who hasn't seen it. And we are hoping to continue the series into the new year, but we do not yet have dates and topics finalised. So if there are any topics that we haven't yet covered and you would like to see us discussing, please do send us your suggestions. I will put email address for myself and Glenn in the chat. So at this point, I will hand over to Glenn, who is going to lead us through the session today. Welcome, Glenn.
Okay, great. Thanks ever so much, Ali. Yes, as Ali said, my name's Glenn Cooper. I'm the Lake Restoration Lead for Natural England. Thanks for joining today, and I'm going to talk to you about lakes and opportunities for their restoration. So just to cover some of the outline of what we're going to talk about today, a bit of context. I'll talk about the current condition and trends in England, what some of the key pressures are on lakes, talk a little bit about principles that underpin lake restoration, and most of the talk will be on a number of case studies to illustrate those. Then think a little bit about some of the mechanisms we've got to do lake restoration, and then some sources of information to help. And I'm sorry if Ali said this already, but the presentation is being recorded, so you don't have to take copious notes. So moving on. So, we recognise that lakes, both naturally formed and human made, are important habitats for wildlife in many of our catchments. But aside that intrinsic value for biodiversity, they're also valued by humans for the wide range of other ecosystem services that they provide: recreation, water supply, energy generation, and a number of commercial activities. But many of those lakes that we particularly value for their biodiversity interest are in a very degraded condition, or indeed under threat. And they're often seen as in sometimes sort of too difficult box to do anything about. What I'm hoping to do with this webinar is to outline the kind of principles what can be done to restore lakes, and through those case studies illustrate some ideas and trial techniques that have been applied to restore them, to show you that action is possible at a range of scales. And I hope by doing that I can inspire you to think about what can be done, or what more can be done to restore lakes in the catchments or in the areas that you work or you live in. So it's a bit of context really. there are about 3,000 lakes above 2 hectares in England, which is quite an astonishing number, really. And there's a diversity of lake types, and so a diversity of wildlife that they support right across the country. We've got the key national lake landscapes, the famous ones of the Cumbrian Lake District and the Norfolk and Suffolk Broads, and also actually the meres and mosses of the Northwest and West Midlands, which are perhaps slightly lesser known maybe by the public, but internationally designated as Ramsars and SACs, many of them. It's also very important. But also we have lakes and reservoirs in every county in the country. And the key thing is here, they represent a key freshwater habitat in catchments that have, already have or have a greater potential to contribute to the nature recovery network. So just to sort of go back to the pressures on lakes, as I said, although they're valued for a great many reasons, they're also subject to a great range of pressures, and some of them are shown here. The key one is both point and diffuse pollution affecting water quality. And that's very much a key pressure on many lakes. That can arise from current inputs, from all sorts of sources, including things like septic tanks, water treatment works, agriculture, road runoff, but also as a historical legacy from the lake's catchment that can end up in the sediment of lakes. And that nutrient enrichment of lakes is implicated in a range of impacts on lake ecosystems, on the submerged and emergent plants, on the fish, on the invertebrate populations, as well as mammals and birds that use lakes. And of course, you've got other impacts along with that, such as pollutants, such as toxic and persistent chemicals. There are also things like modifications to water levels from structures and abstraction. And we have changes to shorelines and loss of edge habitats. There are a whole range of invasive non-native species that threaten lakes, including things like Cratula here. And there are issues as well around things like excess fish stocking on some lakes that can lead from a shift from a natural fish community and depletion of other biodiversity. And then on top of all this, we've got climate change, which is likely to exacerbate some of those pressures, increasing demand on water resources. There's more storm events, which brings with it pollution inputs, algae blooms, etc., and spread of invasive species. Sorry, this is all the bad news at the start. We'll come to the good news in a bit. With the status of the current status of water bodies, as in WFD water bodies, well, most of our freshwater habitats, as we know, are not in great condition. The lakes are no exception to that, really. If you look at the data, we can see that only about 14% as of 2020 are actually in good ecological status. And if we look at sites of special scientific interest, it's a bit more promising. Bearing in mind some of these are also water bodies, but still a significant proportion of these are in unfavorable declining or in no change condition. And if you look at the overall headlines, as I said, we've got about 14% of the nearly 600 WFD lake water bodies in good GES, about 25% of SSSI units which are recorded as lake habitat in favourable. But beyond that, if we take on board, other lake priority habitat, from data that was done for Habitats Directive Article 17 reporting, the degraded condition of lakes in England certainly is quite widespread, and particularly in the lowland, the naturally eutrophic lakes, less than 4% of those are actually in what's considered as you could call good condition. So moving on to being a bit more positive, really, well, what can we do about this? What needs to be done for lakes to recover? So I'm going to take a step back and just think about this. It's a kind of conceptual diagram, really, but the underlying principles are kind of straightforward, even if acting on them may not always be. And the key principle about restoring lakes is to think about the four functions of naturalness, really, and how they have been impacted. So we've got chemical, the physical, the hydrological, and the biological, as shown in this sort of overview diagram here. And restoring any of those components, or ideally all of them, if possible, will lead to some degree of recovery and a greater resilience to those pressures that we talked about, including particularly things like climate change. And even in artificial lakes and reservoirs, there can be scope to improve some of those components towards a more natural function. And I'll try and give a few examples here of what these components look like. So first one is the chemical. And as I said, good water quality is a critical requirement for protecting and restoring, characteristic biological communities in lakes. So the priority here is to address point, source, and diffuse pollution, dealing with those discharges and at source, if at all possible, or changing the land management practices in the catchment, rather than where it enters the lake or on the riparian land, although I acknowledge that that may not always be possible, and I'll show some case studies where some things have been done to address that. There are other ways you can address sources of nutrients to reduce internal loading from the nutrient enrichment in sediments. But it's always very important to consider plans for any sediment removal carefully, not least because it can be expensive, but mainly because you want to ensure that you're dealing or have plans to deal with the nutrient and sediment loading from external sources before you start taking that kind of sediment removal action. Looking at the physical side of things, for the riparian habitat, including lakeshore wetlands, they have an intrinsic conservation value as part of lake habitat in their own right, and they can support a range of lake function and species. And a great deal of that has been lost through drainage and change in land use that's adjacent to lakes. Shorelines are often straightened, too steep. They've been completely devoid of any vegetation, or in some cases, like here, very truncated, and preventing a kind of more natural transition from the wet into dry habitats, and thus the sort of species and interaction across them. And that loss of that marginal vegetation with shallow shorelines and transitions can have major implications for the lake biodiversity. It can impact on water quality and actually, lead to increases in things like erosion from wave action. So aiming to restore that full range of transitional habitats is really important. Moving on to the third component, the kind of hydrological side. Got a couple of examples here of some of the impacts on lake hydrology. We've got dams and weirs that can lead to unnatural drawdown zones in lakes, or drainage channels that have been cut through what would have been the surrounding wetland to a lake. And the aim here really is to try and remove some of those, if possible, or at least limit the impact of some of those modifications, restoring things like natural inflows and outflows, and more natural water levels and fluctuations. An example of a simple intervention there. And finally, onto the biological component. It's the other core component really for restoration of natural function. Now, we know that invasive non-native species are an all too common threat, and aiming to eradicate those or reduce realistically where we can is really the best approach, although with some plant species, minimizing the risk of spread from sites where it's already established is probably the most effective action. You can see a large crasser infestation there. The impact of things like non-native fish or an unbalanced fish community can be problematic, particularly in shallow lakes, and it can lead to changes in lake ecology. And we can use techniques such as biomanipulation to restore a more natural biological community and give the lake ecosystem a kind of kickstart and accelerate recovery. But again, need to stress the importance of having actions in place to address water quality and excess nutrients entering a lake, which can exacerbate those impacts. So I'll move on now to some example case studies. Now, several of these are taken from work that Natural England's been involved in or with partners. They're really just a snapshot, but they're hoping they will illustrate what can be done at a range of scales. And I'll start with some kind of larger projects and move through to some of the maybe smaller ones, but they're all kind of interesting and potentially valuable approaches. So starting with the big stuff, really. This here shows examples at both Crummock Water and Ennerdale up in Cumbria, and these are big projects to address an alternative need for a public water supply, and so resolve the pressures of abstraction and modification to lake hydrology that you can see there, with the these kind of large scale structures impounding the lakes. Now the abstraction is ceasing this year, and those structures will in time be removed. And these are big projects and they're big investments. They're funded through the water company price review process, and they've required a great deal of work across several years with stakeholders, many stakeholders, to get them to kind of get to this point. The purpose of including them really is to show that there are these things going on, and restoring natural function to lakes, even where it may have been thought previously impossible, actually can be achieved. And we can move towards restoring natural function in those systems, particularly at somewhere like Ennerdale, which is part of that much wider catchment and nature recovery approach. And continuing with a side sort of project such as dam removal, there are several examples of sort of larger scale lake restorations, particularly in shallow lakes. And they've often involved the removal or reuse of enriched sediments that have been deposited over the years. And they're then done as part of a range of techniques to restore clear water condition in lakes, so that lost aquatic plants, more natural invertebrate and fish communities can recover. One of the really early ones was Cockshoot Broad in Norfolk, shown here, where a whole range of techniques were tried, and it included removal of accumulated silt to help the lake recovery. And more recent examples include the ongoing restoration that's happening at Hoverton Great Broad, also in Norfolk. And there's also very large-scale sediment removal, which is part of a restoration of Blenheim Park Lake in Oxfordshire. And it's important to recognise that aside the removal of that historic nutrient enrichment to reduce a degree of internal nutrient loading, there's also often other important drivers for doing so, which is often creating more stable sediment for aquatic plants to establish, and to increase water depth to reduce issues of deoxygenation and also effects of uprooting that can come from wave action. So, as I said, there are lots of examples of these kind of approaches, particularly in shallow lakes and in East Anglia. Just a couple of case studies here. Barton Broad is probably one of the most famous or well-documented examples. There were, following decades of point source and diffuse pollution from nutrients in the catchment, the condition of the broad declined really dramatically into the kind of 1970s and 80s, with really algae-dominated turbid water, a loss of the plant and animal invertebrate communities in the lake. Additional phosphate stripping and diversion of wastewater treatment was put in to move effluent away from the broad by the water company in the 80s, and that led to improved water quality in the river system connected to the broad. But the loading from the sediment still thought to be too high, so a large sediment removal operation was carried out in the 90s to reduce that reservoir of nutrients and further improve the water clarity. And then in the early 2000s, biomanipulation, the fish population was all carried out in some large fish exclosures in the broad to accelerate that restoration of plant invert communities. You can see the effect of that work in this aerial photo here. And by the mid-2000s, clearer water was kind of established, and some plant recovery was evident outside of those areas. I actually went to the site this summer, and you could see there's still sustained growth of macrophytes in those biomanipulated areas. So it's an ongoing approach, and it looks to be successful. Some more recent work I just want to draw your attention to, which is about work on sediment reuse, and that's being done by the Broads Authority, and looking at reuse of sediments that's been dredged for navigation channels. There's an example here from Hickling Broad where there's been extensive loss of the reedbed and fen on the lake edge, and you can see from a 1940s RAF photograph where it used to be. I think this is called Cara Bay. And what the Broads Authority have done have taken navigational sediment and pumped it into bunded areas, and using pre-planted coir mats with reed and typha rhizomes, and also some direct planting. They're trying to recreate this whole area of that lost lake edge. And that work has happened this year and is being monitored. And there's lots of other projects around sediment reuse. There's some links here that you can follow, and Dan Hoare very kindly provided these examples, and you can follow those up yourself if you're interested. Moving away from the Broads now, this is Wetlands in West Shropshire, and this is really to talk about restoration of lakes without sediment removal. There's ongoing work here to try and restore this site. It's both SSSI and Ramsar. Water quality in Wetlands had become really quite degraded, both from point and diffuse pollution sources. The fish community in the lake had become dominated by benthivorous and other species at quite high densities, along with the water quality issues from the catchment that led to turbid water and loss of macrophyte. As I said, sediment wasn't removed as an example, and the focus has instead been on improving the water quality to the mere and managing the fish population. So to do that, they diverted a wastewater treatment outflow to further downstream. There were silt traps installed on inflows around the lake from the surrounding land. Changes to agriculture in the catchment, so switching from things like maize into arable reversion. And then also working with the landowner and the angling club that managed the lake, Aldermere. There was a fish barrier installed, you can see it there, in 2017, and some trial fish removals done to reduce the predation pressure on the zooplankton that can help to clear out that algal turbidity. And also the to avoid or get less disturbance of plants by those benthivorous fish species in that part of the lake. And you can see the effect either side of the barrier in that aerial photo, and actually a close up there too. Now there's been some, and you can see further down here the turbidity shown as in the biomanipulated and non-biomanipulated side of the barrier, and you know, some in-water shots of the difference in water clarity. There's been some evidence of some macrophyte recovery in the clearer side, but it's clear that we're going to need some further action on sources of nutrients in the catchment, and also restore the hydrology further, so we get more flushing to naturally flush the mere, to see if that recovery can be sustained, along with that more, you know, and a more self-sustaining fish community. But you know, it's an interesting project, and it's to understand the effectiveness of actions on all those pressures on Betley Mere, and particularly think about in the wider context of the West Midlands meres and mosses. Moving up north now to Cumbria, this is Elterwater. It's another example really of using hydrology and natural processes to help restore a lake. Elterwater is a triple SI. It's situated in the Lake District, and it consists of 3 interconnected basins, which you can just see in that shot there, hopefully. Now the inflows, actually the Elterwater had historically received discharges from the local water treatment plant from the 70s through to the late 90s, and the original inflows to the lake had been altered probably way back in the 1940s, and there's also septic tanks in the catchment. Now lots of those major inputs have ceased, but because of this restricted or the limited flow through the system, it meant that nutrients were not leaving Elterwater, and the water levels have become quite undynamic, and that's led to degradation of the in-lake and shoreline plant communities. And now there's been a sequence of restoration efforts and monitoring to restore the hydrological function of the site, and that's been led by the South Cumbria's Rivers Trust, working with United Utilities and Natural England, and should credit Simon Webb from Natural England with a lot of the work here. And what that's done is, some of the work that's been done here is actually included moving and renaturalizing inflows and restoring the flows to improve that water quality. And you can see the most recent work here, which was done around using cleaner water from the Greater Langdale Beck, arrowed at the top there. And this is work done by the South Cumbria's Rivers Trust. And the idea is to restore a more dynamic system and connectivity from the beck back to the lake, so recreating the kind of channels through to the middle basin. You can see how those sinuous channels have been cut through some secondary woodland between the beck and into Elterwater. And the idea is that at times of high flow, that should start to flush Elterwater and help rid some of the lake of some of the nutrients that have accumulated in sediments over time. Which should also obviously potentially help with oxygen deficient problems, and also hopefully lead to more seasonal variation in the shoreline levels and support the restoration of some of those characteristic shoreline plant communities. And there's ongoing monitoring now to see how effective that enhanced flushing is. So this example I'm going to move to next is Rossford National Nature Reserve, and this is up in Cheshire. I'm flagging this one here as an example of a smaller scale approach to improve water quality on lakes. It's one of the deepest meres in the area. It's got a very steep sided catchment, and it has particular interest for its algae and also macrophyte communities in the lake. But it has had very elevated nutrient levels of both nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's not meeting its targets for favourable condition. There have been a lot of actions from CSF, Catchment Sensitive Farming Project, and the National Nature Reserve team to work with landowners and tenants in the catchment to try and reduce the point source and diffuse pollution sources, and extensify the grazing around the mere. In addition, they've done various works like installing lots of these kind of woody debris dams to slow the flow on the key inflows into the mere. That's one there. But there's also been a whole work done on creating a sequence of wetland lagoons and settling ponds to reduce the sediment inputs at times of high flow, and whilst doing that, restore lake shore wetland habitat. And you can see some of those examples there. This is when some of the sediment ponds were first installed, and actually over the last year or two, they've actually developed into some really quite nice fringing wetland habitat with, you know, much more natural pools, and you know, and a whole range of wetland plants have actually kind of regenerated here. There have also been some techniques using things like wire rolls and earth buns to create these kind of sequence sediment mitigation ponds into Rosthern. There's a bit more detail on some photographs of some of the approaches here. The project has been looking for old field drains, breaking those out, and looking to restore the original springs and flushes around Rosthern to restore that hydrology on multiple inflows into the site. So lots of creation of this kind of habitat, or restoration of this habitat. It's a kind of pragmatic example, really. There are limitations imposed by the kind of shape of the catchment, and not possible to deal with all those nutrient inputs and sediment inputs right at source. But by using this kind of multiple intervention approach around on as many inflows as possible, that the ambition is to improve the water quality, and there is some evidence, I understand, of that coming through in the algal populations. Smaller scale still, really, to show you another example. We looked at some of the large scale things about restoring hydrological function, weirs and things like, and a bit more somewhere like Elterwater. This is an example from Crosemere and Sweatmere, site of special scientific interest. In the 18th, 19th century, it's estimated that water levels were lowered by something like 1 to 2 meters through massive drainage in the catchment. And what has been trialled here is using a number of things, actually, but blocking large land drains with some simple kind of low-cost log dams, with the idea of raising the water levels by about a foot on the outflows, and in one of the main drains that dug right through the centre of the site. And that work's been done in tandem as well with measures to improve water quality under countryside stewardship. So there's been arable reversion from maize fields surrounding the mere. They've moved to more extensive grazing and modifying the grazing regime again to help develop a kind of better transition from Crosemere into the surrounding fen on the peat, and then towards, if you like, called the upland. So again, trying to reduce that and improve that transitional habitat. Now there's more work to do here, and to restore the water levels further. People recognise that actually beavers could probably do a better job here, but the purpose of this example again is to show that there are simple low-cost approaches that you can start to do to restore the hydrology of a whole basin, and show that that is possible. Not a million miles away is Hatchmere in Cheshire. This is a Cheshire Wildlife Trust site. It's an example of another lake where there's a range of approaches that are being trialled to restore hydrological function and water quality of the mere and the wetlands. It's become degraded by nutrient enrichment from diffuse sources. The surrounding wetland have become drier from drainage and from afforestation, and it lost much of its characteristic, plant community in the mere, potentially through both enrichment and the impacts of an unbalanced fish population. So various things have been trialled. There's been work in a catchment by the Catchment Sensitive Farming Project to make changes to land management. There was a trial of a product called Phoslock, which is a kind of bentonite clay-based sediment capping product. That was trialled as well, though it wasn't particularly successful in controlling phosphate release. A couple of trial fish exclosures have been established to look at the feasibility of biomanipulation of the fish community to promote macrophyte recovery. And again, monitoring of that continues. And there've been lots of ditch blocking on the site. Main inflows were remeandered and dams installed to restore the wetland adjacent to the mere. But now beavers have been introduced as well. That's back in 2020 in an enclosure, and they have led to really quite significant modification of hydrology, and they've created this really quite impressive dam you can see here, and lots of other blocking of drains much more effectively. You can see, they've been far more effective at raising water levels than was done previously, that adjoins the lake. And again, there's ongoing monitoring to see how the impacts on water quality in both the inflows and the mere is being benefited by that action. I want to talk a bit about lake edge habitats. And there are some good examples we've got of where we've had lost lake edge habitats, rather as we saw at Hickling, through both erosion and historic impacts of nutrient enrichment. And they've been restored using a number of techniques. And there's an example here at Ranworth Broad, which is a Norfolk Wildlife Trust site. They cleared about 10 to 20 meters of scrub on the broad edge. to reduce the shading of edge habitats and the open water, punched holes through to other existing areas of tall herd fen. These choir mats with typha and phragmites staked into them, and also plug planter sedges and other fens to restore that fen edge and link it up with other areas. And it's been really effective actually. It's only over 2 or 3 years that work's happened. There's been a similar kind of a bit slightly different way of doing it at Hofton Great Broad, where from the kind of using unstable mud or the sediment from the bottom of the broad that was removed, that was pumped into geotextile bags and then created a number of artificial banks. The sediment was pumped behind those and created new graded edges to the broad as part of that whole broad restoration. And they've been covered in these translocated turfs of fen vegetation from elsewhere on the NNR. And that quickly established and that degraded what was lost edge habitat. And it's been really, really successful. You can see the kind of, the effectiveness and prolific growth of that edge habitat here. The netting, by the way, is to stop bird predation. The Hofton example, you can look at this on the Hofton website, but this shows the process of how that creation of the fen edge areas was done, filling these geotextile tubes and then translocating the reed and fen sods onto that to let them regrow. But yeah, that's another technique that's been successfully trialed. There are also elsewhere outside of the Broads, really good examples of lake edge reedbed loss on other lakes, and in particular on somewhere like Windermere. And there are some examples, courtesy of Ruth Hall, these images of changes to lake, the amount of reed cover. And you can see from these historic photographs how it's dramatically declined in these areas, something like 90% loss of that habitat on Windermere. But there's been really good work done by the again, South Cumbria's Rivers Trust, looking at reedbed restoration. Quite a lot was done under a previous project called Windermere Reflections, but there's been a much more recent project that's still ongoing to restore reedbed sites across Windermere, and that's getting on for 800 square meters of reedbed creation and restoration. And that's been funded through United Utilities Catchment Systems Thinking Fund. And that has also included, engaging communities in that work and getting, people involved in the replanting activity through work parties and public engagement. So there's a really nice link in there to practical lake restoration that people can get involved in. I'll just take a glass of water, excuse me. A couple of again, smaller scale works here really, but again can still benefit lake shorelines and the surrounding habitat interest. At Crosemere in Shropshire, it's the site managed by the Shropshire County Council. It happens to be the only remaining site in England for least yellow water lily, Nuphar pumila, and that's a red list species. And through some number of funding, but partly through countryside stewardship and other funding, there's been various small-scale felling works of the trees, and particularly plantation conifers surrounding the mere, to reduce the shading and enhance the conditions for the plant to try and maintain it at that site. This example over here is Short Heath Common, and this is in Hampshire. And this is it's called a pond. It's actually a pretty large pond. It probably, that distinction of 2 hectares for a lake is a bit arbitrary. Many people consider anything over a hectare is a lake, but there is a sort of a moving definition. But it's a large pond, almost a lake. And it's site managed, as I said, by Hampshire County Council, and works were carried out by the local authority using countryside stewardship to reduce the tree cover and restore that open water to mire transition that's really important, and reduce the shading of the edge where the emergent plants are. That's particularly important for the invertebrates, particularly dragonflies at this site, and that are using that transitional habitat, but obviously also the mire community that is directly adjacent to the pond itself. So again, quite relatively small scale, but very important for the ecological function of those sites. I want to say a quick bit on invasive non-native species. I mean, it's kind of a talk in its own right, really, but really just to note that we do have some examples where concentrated effort to eradicate invasive species can be successful. there's a really good campaign by the Environment Agency leading on eradicating water primrose, and they've had good successes with tackling that as it appears in various farm ponds as it comes in. We've also had some work done at some sites. Example here of it, Stover Park SSSI in Devon, and that was done in advance of a proposed lake restoration. And here there was drawdown of the lake, which enabled some mechanical and herbicide control of Crassula in those marginal areas, and it has been successful so far in reducing the extent of the Crassula kind of invasion. Although it's recognised probably going to have to follow up with some spot spraying to keep on top of it, and it's clearly not going to be appropriate or possible at all or all sites. And really, the take-home message here is that the best approach is really to raise awareness around invasives and prevent their introduction and spread across sites through things such as the Check, Clean and Dry campaign, rather than try and deal with them once they've got themselves established at a site. Just moving on to the last of the examples now, really. I was thinking about, this links to the invasive side really, but also the challenges of managing lake sites with public access and balancing the pressure that comes from that with the biodiversity and the desire to have people appreciate lakes and people really value them and like to spend time near them. Couple of examples of simple ways being tried to achieve that. This is at Heath in Berkshire. It's a shallow acid oligotrophic lake. It's got this really nice characteristic shoreline community. You can see through this kind of clear water here, the Elatinea hexandria, which is a six-stamen water starwort, has Littorella in it, which is quite unusual in lowland England, really. But it's also really popular for recreation, particularly dog walking. There's a nice circular loop around the lake. There's a car park, but what the local authority have done is they've tried coppicing trees to reduce the shading around these shoreline communities, and you use the cuttings from those to create these kind of brash piles or dead hedges to limit the access to vulnerable areas of that shoreline edge, to stop some of the dogs running into the water and also disturbing particularly birds that are nesting in those areas, but also in turn protecting some of that lake edge habitat where these more vulnerable plants grow. And they've used simple interpretive signage to tell people what's going on and why they're doing it. So that's one example. Another one that's quite interesting is something that's happened this year, which is up in Cumbria and Bathurst. There's a trial project here which has been done by the West Cumbria's Rivers Trust. There's been increasing visitor pressure at Bass, which is, particularly through COVID, which has led to some increased trampling and sort of eroded shoreline areas. And you can see some of the effect of that, on what these plant communities in areas such as this, and where there's a real desire lines for people to access the shoreline. And this year they did a small scale trial project to mimic kind of natural tree falls to prevent or steer access away from some of those most vulnerable or heavily used areas. And they've used this kind of dead hedging technique as well as living hedge by using willow pegs in some of these areas. This work is being combined with sort of positive engagement with the lake users to talk to them about use of the lake. So it's not just seen as limiting access, but it is to sort of help try and prevent some of the pressures and extension of that damage in some of these areas. And the idea is to kind of monitor the effectiveness of that and see if it could be used at other sites, either further on the lake itself or in other sites in the Lake District. So that's really just an example of another low cost, kind of low impact technique. So what I've shown you here, I think, really with those is a sort of just a snapshot of different restoration approaches on some of those components of lake function. But some of those, hopefully are sort of, interesting to consider if it's possible to use elsewhere. So if I kind of summarize now, really, improving water quality is really one of the key actions to take for lakes. And working with landowners around their best practice soil and nutrient pollution management, on their land and in the catchment, and also working with water companies to think about investigations and potential schemes that can address, point sources of pollution. But aside that, very important water quality work, there are tangible improvements to improve lake condition that can be achieved with other measures, but can also help with water quality. And those include restoring, more natural hydrology where opportunities allow for that, to increase natural flushing of lakes that may have a legacy of enrichment in sediment. And that can also help obviously restore natural variation in water level, and naturalizing those inflows can help to mitigate the delivery of excess nutrients into lakes. All the work on restoring shorelines, and the riparian vegetation, such as reedbed or fen fringes, and those wetlands that would naturally surround a lake and would be beneficial for biodiversity in their own right, may have added benefits for water quality. And for some lakes, particularly those that are especially protected or as priority habitats or SSSIs, looking at restoring more natural fish communities and abundances can be part of that approach to restoring biodiversity, along with those controls on nutrient enrichment, particularly where lakes have become turbid and they've lost their plant and invertebrate and then their native fish communities. And as I said, measures to minimise the spread of invasive non-native species are really valuable, with improved awareness for recreational users particularly. And the third one really, which is really more from a strategic perspective, is thinking about raising the awareness of lakes with stakeholders, particularly as things like the new local nature recovery strategies start to take shape, and flagging their importance in catchments, alongside the mosaic of rivers and wetlands and ponds, and how that is all part of the nature recovery network picture. And as catchment plans are updated and they evolve, encouraging you really to think about how lakes are captured in those, and if you could be done to restore them, and particularly thinking about those aspects of natural function and restoring that and the surrounding wetlands. So I've talked a lot about ideas, and we've shown you some examples of how these things have been done. Just to quickly remind you of some of the mechanisms that we do have available to do that. There are a range of although things they can be considered expensive and too difficult to restore lakes, we do have some mechanisms. There is the water company price review program that I've referenced, and again thinking there are increasingly kind of drive towards more catchment based solutions through that funding. We've got examples of using countryside stewardship capital funding to restore lakes, and there are lots of other options in stewardship to reduce and mitigate diffuse pollution. And there is still potentially scope for agreements that could start in 2024. And I'd seek advice from your local Natural England or catchment sensitive farming staff if you've got any examples of that. NGO organisations such as National Trust and Wildlife Trust and local authorities have funded work directly on their sites. Both Natural England, we have our own grant in aid, and we're able to use that at some lakes, and hopefully we'll have the potential to do that in the future. The Environment Agency have been able to utilise some of their Water Environment Improvement Fund funding to help on a couple of sites in supporting investigations on lake projects. And there are other avenues around things such as Heritage Lottery funding, which has been used on Hoverton and at Stover Great Park, and also Highways Agency funding for looking at any impacts from road runoff has been used in a number of restoration proposals. So all avenues to explore. We've obviously got the upcoming new mechanism under environmental land management schemes, and we're hoping we're going to have good options in there for maintaining, improving and creating lakes, as well as restoring that lake riparian habitat. And I think that there's, I'll be honest, I haven't explored it properly yet, but opportunities under biodiversity net gain for lake habitat improvement. And there may be other mechanisms that you are aware of financing, and be really interested to know if people have had successful ways of financing lake restoration or investigation through other channels. And just sort of finishing off now, really, this is around information sources. And I mean, I've been working with CABA to try and raise the profile of lakes, and there's information now to help partnerships understand the pressures on and the status of lakes and what they can do, and that's on the Catchment Based Approach website. There's the CABA Lake Story Map, which I provocatively titled "Cherished Yet Forgotten." It includes some of the examples and points I've made today, and has lots of links to information and data on it. There are also the CABA Biodiversity Group, which Ali and I sit on, has produced a number of habitat guides and includes ones for lakes and other wetland and water habitats, and that they very much incorporate that principle of restoring elements of natural function. And recently, we've kind of been involved in launching the Cabba Biodiversity Hub, and that gives access to a whole load of biodiversity and other data, and a really nice interactive mapping facility, which you could use to help if you're thinking about putting a lake into its catchment context. And just a couple of focus on that. Within the Cabba Lake story map, there's a really nice tool, interactive zoomable tool you can use, which will get you into both the EAs and WFD data, Catchment Data Explorer and SSSI data, and you can use it as a direct kind of portal to that. And the other one to flag is the CEH's UK Lakes portal, which is brilliant database, which has got all sorts of parameters about lakes and water quality data that you can download through that. And just one final kind of plug, really. This is an opportunity to highlight that there's through the catchment-based approach, we've been doing work with the naturally been doing work with the Freshwater Biological Association, and that's the opportunity for catchment partnerships and citizen scientists to contribute their data around lake and other freshwater priority habitats. And this is really to help identify where the best lake sites are that have high degrees of naturalness, or where there are priorities to restore outside the existing kind of known SSSI and water body networks. There are kind of two routes to doing that. One is can be done with dedicated support, which we hope to get from the FBA, which can help catchment partnerships and others identify those priorities, and also the citizen scientist angle, which is contributing data on naturalness of lakes. And if you follow these links on there, there's a video and a link to the guidance that supports how to do that. So for summary, really just to finish up, so what I've tried to do is highlight the kind of principles around restoring lakes, where that's feasible and appropriate towards more natural function. And whilst there are lots of pressures on lakes, there are lots of measures that are being used and tried to address and restore them. Water quality remains that key pressure, and so any action really towards addressing that is improving it is worth doing. But as I said, there are other interventions that can be made, especially around things like restoring shorelines and surrounding habitats and hydrological function, that might be more achievable in a shorter time frame. And I'm hoping that by citing those, showing you those examples and some of these principles, I've helped to raise awareness of the actions that what can be done. And so, hopefully people can become more engaged and aware of them. I'm hoping this webinar has gone some way to doing that today. So I think that's it. Yes, thank you, Ali. I hope that's okay. I'll come off sharing my screen now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Glenn. That was quite a run through loads of really interesting examples. We've got about over 5 minutes left for a few questions. I've been keeping an eye on the chat as we've been going through, and quite a lot of discussion in there around the sediment aspect. So I will pull a few questions on those together in just a second. Very briefly, firstly, some of you will have seen in the chat a message from Jenny at the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. Jenny, would you just like to say a very quick few words about the work that you're doing with Esme? And just for everyone's information, when I sort the recording from this session, we'll send details around of a link so you can watch back and share with colleagues. We can also include some info from Jenny so that people can get in touch with her directly.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, it's very, very early days, but I moved to the Esme Fairbairn Trust in September to look at a freshwater programme across the UK for them. And it's very much around supporting new ways for particularly community-led sort of projects to work to improve freshwaters. So as I say, it's at a really early stage, but I'm particularly looking for where we've got community-driven sort of interest in doing something. So it's really just to sort of flag that up and to, say that sort of scoping out what we might be able to do and just looking for the unusual suspects, I guess, in a way. And it's very much the focus of the programme I'm looking at is very much around people as well as wildlife. Esme Fairbairn Foundation funds work across the natural world, but also social, racial injustice and inequality of all sorts. So it's really bringing those things together. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy for people to get in touch with me, but with the caveat that it's very much early days and I'm kind of feeling my way into the role. But yeah, just wanting to kind of put out there that we're looking at it, and it is across the UK. And at the minute, the sort of Scotland, Wales, particularly Northern Ireland part of it, we don't have loads of contacts. So that would be somewhere where perhaps facilitating getting people together would be part of what we might do. Thanks, Ali.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny. As I said, we'll send some further details around as well after the webinar. So in terms of questions, a lot of discussion around sediment, and I've just tried to sort of pull together the main sort of queries around those. One around what do you think the prevalence of the internal loading has been sort of overlooked in the past? A number of people saying that they're finding in their schemes that seems to be quite an important component, and we tend to concentrate on the present day inputs from the catchment, but actually the internal loadings from sediment already in the lake system can be quite significant, can do things like exacerbate issues with invasive macrophytes like azolla. And are there means of looking at the sort of relative contributions to that sediment of different sectors in terms of being able to encourage them to potentially contribute to the cost of dealing with that legacy? Oh, we can't hear you, Glenn, or at least I can't hear you. I still cannot hear you. How strange. No, I'm not getting any sound at the moment. It might just be me. No, other people are shaking heads. Oh dear. Don't quite know what's happened there. Okay, maybe we will get Glenn to try and answer through the chat. I'll just sort of reflect on those sites, on those questions a little bit more. So a lot of discussion about which kind of lake types are sort of most amenable to this, and discussion around the issue with cost, the issue with whether you have to repeat sediment removal over time, and certainly if you haven't dealt with nitrates and phosphates and so on coming in from in the catchment, then that might be, it's not necessarily just a one-off event. Oh, I'm getting crackling. That might be you back, Glenn.
Can you hear me or not?
Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. I don't know, that helps. It's pretty fast and I can type. Yeah, so I was trying to make my laptop work. To go back to the first question, with sediment removal, yes, I mean, there in terms of the internal nutrient loading, I mean, I suppose the risk is that you can spend quite a lot of time trying to calculate the different proportions of internal to external loading, and it is valuable to understand that balance. But actually, it's my understanding is, and that's why I was going to defer to Ruth Hall, who I don't know if she's on the line, but is it's a very complex process to do that. There is some kind of source apportionment work you can try and to do that, but there's a lot of uncertainty in those calculations, and the risk is that you spend a lot of time worrying about what to do with the internal sediment and then stop acting on the external inputs. And whilst any of those external inputs are still coming into the system, they are still contributing to the nutrient loading of the site. So it's a tricky one, because yes, you do want to, there is a need to understand what's happening with the internal loading, but not at the expense of stopping any action on external inputs and think, oh, we won't bother to deal with the external stuff because it must all be coming from the lake sediment. So yeah, I don't know if Ruth's online, if she's got anything to add to that.
Ruth has been picking up some of the questions in the chat.
Okay.
There's also been one in there around the different carbon implications of different approaches. which has been picked up, and all of the links that have been put in the chat or were in Glenn's presentation we'll also share as well. One final, because I see we're up to time, and one final quick question. Would you treat online and offline lakes the same, or are there different approaches that you'd likely to be taking in different circumstances?
And I've seen about online, sort of online river systems. Potentially, yes. Again, probably would come down to the nutrient status of the input. So if something is online, you've obviously got potentially, much greater input of nutrients and sediments into those, and that might change how you approach. You may have less control, and it could be that on, say, an online lake, you look at what you can do, maybe focusing around on maybe some of the sort of transitional side of habitats and that side of things, where you might be able to get more biodiversity benefit if you don't have as much control over the other nutrient sources. So kind of without knowing the individual specific circumstances, I think, that would be, something to think about is how much control you have over the nutrient inputs and water quality, and that might determine where you focus your effort.
Brilliant, thank you, Glenn. I think we are now out of time, and I can see a number of people have had to leave for other meetings, so I think we will wrap it up there. I've had a couple of suggestions through by email for future potential topics, so we'll look at picking those up in the new year. And final reminder of our follow-on webinar next month on floodplain meadows. We will circulate a link to the recording and all of the various resources we've mentioned, and thank you very much to everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you all. I'll try and respond to it. Yeah, thanks, Alice. I'll try and respond to anything that wasn't picked up by anyone else in the chat. But yeah, apologies for the sound problems there. But yeah, I'll try and respond to anything that isn't been done. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.